All right. So your textbook talks about two different ways of describing people's political beliefs, political attitudes versus political ideologies. And I want to spend a little time on the difference between those two concepts. Political attitudes are about how you feel about change, whether you like it, whether you don't like it, how much of you want, how fast you want it to happen, and by what means you think it's acceptable to make it happen or not happen. They are conventionally arranged on a left-right spectrum. That's where we get this language of people on the left wing or being on the far right, things like that, or people being centrists for that matter. And they are context specific. So a leftist in the United States might have different values from a leftist in, say, the Soviet Union in 1989. Political ideologies, on the other hand, are about values and beliefs that people hold. They generally deal with a balance between freedom and equality. There are other ways of conceptualizing them, but your textbook uses those terms, freedom and equality, as the two basic values that a society might want to achieve, and we're going to stick with that for our purposes in this course. And they should be applicable in different contexts. So if you have a libertarian political ideology in the United States, that's the same thing as a libertarian political ideology in France, in the United Kingdom, in China, in Russia, et cetera, et cetera. To illustrate that spectrum of political attitudes on the left to right scale, let's look at an example. And I'm going to use my favorite caricatured floating head, Bernie Sanders, longtime member of the United States Senate, two-time candidate for the Democratic nomination for the presidency. In the United States, Bernie Sanders is considered pretty far left of center, and so we're going to put his floating head right here on the left end of the spectrum. And that's because what Bernie Sanders advocates are some policies that would represent pretty drastic changes from the way that politics currently works, the way that the United States government currently operates as we stand. So things like universal health care, things like free college for everybody or abolishing debt, those are pretty drastic departures from what the government does in the US today. And so they make Bernie Sanders pretty far left of center in the American context. You'll note that I'm not putting his floating head all the way on the left of the spectrum. And that's because Sanders ultimately works within the system. He works in the United States Senate. He's run for the presidency as a candidate, he's run for the nomination of one of the two major parties in United States politics. He's not out there trying to burn down the system. He's not advocating a violent or sweeping revolution, even though he uses the word revolution a lot. So he's not all the way on the left, but he is pretty far to the left, at least among people who believe in working within the system as opposed to burning it down. However, if you were to take Bernie Sanders with his beliefs in things like free healthcare and more redistribution of common assets, and put him in some place like Norway or Sweden, all of a sudden his political attitudes would shift much closer to the center of the spectrum, and we might actually describe Sanders as a moderate in terms of the politics he advocates. And the reason for that is because in a country like Norway or Sweden, a lot of what Bernie Sanders wants to happen is already happening, and so his ideology would call for less change in the status quo in the way things are right now. So attitudes arranged on a left to right spectrum relative to change and the rate of change that you want, and most importantly, context specific. Ideologies, on the other hand, are more stable across contexts. And they deal with how you want to strike the balance between two basic sets of values. One is freedom, which is the degree to which people can go do what they want. The other is equality, which is the similarity between people's material standard of living. And it's really worth emphasizing that equality is about material resources, not just about the equality of people's enjoyments of civil or political rights, things like voting and freedom of speech. I'm going to put a graph up on the chart or up on the screen, and I want you to pause the video for a second and see if you can label these axes as being more freedom, less freedom, more equality, less equality. All right, I'm going to show you the answers. If I have arranged these political ideologies, which are defined in your textbook in this way, then that vertical axis has less freedom at the top and more freedom at the bottom. And then that horizontal axis has more equality, more material equality and redistribution on the left and less equality on the right. If you glance in O'Neill, I believe that you will find these different ideologies represented at slightly different points on the spectrum. And it's important to note that anytime you see political ideologies graphed in this way. The origin and like where you are on the X or Y axis, or like what the coordinates would be of any given point, are not super important, because in the real world, there's no such thing as like exactly zero equality or -10 equality. This is a fiction. What's really important to pay attention to here is the relative positions of these ideologies, which is why different graphs of different people or ideologies, including the ones in your textbook versus the ones here, will probably look a little bit different from each other. Couple more ideologies that don't fit quite as neatly on this chart, but I do want you to have the definitions of, and you're responsible for knowing, because they'll pop up as we go through our case study countries in this course. Individualism is kind of what it sounds like. It calls for less government intervention, more individual freedom. Libertarianism is a related term that means pretty similar things, but you need to know individualism to describe that idea that the government should just get out of everybody's business. Neoliberalism is an historically specific term that describes people who are reacting against a trend of increased regulation. Neoliberals in the last few decades have called specifically for the government to reduce its role in the economy. Social democracy and socialism, we're going to use interchangeably in this course. I personally prefer social democracy because when you use the term socialism, Marxists get extremely particular about what you might mean. There's a huge debate among Marxists about exactly what these things mean. Social democracy, which is a term that in the United States we associate with people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, means that we want more redistribution, we want more material equality within the framework of an electoral democracy. So without the attempt of, ideally without compromising people's individual freedom. Populism is really more of a style than it is an ideology, and it means a bunch of different things. It can encompass a bunch of different ideologies, but fundamentally populism is a political style which supports common people's interests over the interests of the elite. Anytime you see a politician claiming to stand up for ordinary people or stand up for the working class or want to drain the swamp in Washington, they're invoking populist rhetoric. You live, I think, in particularly populist times in American politics, so you hear people on the social democratic end of the Democratic Party using populist rhetoric about bringing down big corporations, but you also hear Donald Trump frequently using populist rhetoric about attacking Washington elites and attacking Wall Street elites and attacking big corporations like Amazon. Whether those people actually mean to do what they say they're going to do is an entirely separate question, but they are using populist rhetoric to try and say, I stand with ordinary people, as opposed to fancy people who already have power and privilege. So you do need to know all those other political ideologies as well. Political socialization refers to the process of acquiring your beliefs, your values, your orientations towards the political system. Couple things to note about this. Number one, political socialization is lifelong. Your political values, believe it or not, are not permanently fixed in your mind at the age of 17 or whatever you are. They change over the course of your life. They develop over the course of your life. And so that process is ongoing throughout the course of a person's existence. Second, political socialization doesn't just determine how you develop your ideology. So do you believe that same-sex marriage should be legal? Do you believe that the government should tax people and provide health care for all of its citizens? It also refers to these other kind of orientations and understandings, right? So your understanding of how politics works, if you get how the Electoral College operates, that resulted from a process of political socialization. If you think that the two-party system is morally bankrupt and inefficient, then that's a result of your political socialization. If you believe that politics is ineffective and that the government just never really succeeds in achieving lasting change, or if you believe that your vote doesn't matter and it won't change anything, that's a result of political socialization. So it's not just what you believe about specific policy points, but also your more general understanding of how politics works in the US. Couple of agents of political socialization, so factors in your life that help you develop your political beliefs. Family is a huge one. It's pretty common for people in the United States to vote Democrat if their parents were Democrat, and vice versa if their parents were Republican. Schools are a huge agent of political socialization, not just because teachers like me evilly try to indoctrinate you with our political beliefs, but also because schools are a major place where you learn how the political process works. Your peers, your neighbors, your friends, I suspect a bunch of you wrote down that your political values were shaped by growing up, if you did, in Cambridge, which is a pretty liberal city, a pretty left of center city by American standards. And so the area you grew up in and the people you grew up with are a huge source of political socialization for you. Religious institutions can really help form people's political values, whether or not they explicitly encourage you to have a certain political belief. Media are a very, very important form of political socialization. And if you've spent any time thinking about the difference between people who watch MSNBC versus people who watch Fox News, or if you've spent any time thinking about the way in which social media kind of shoves you into a political bubble and feeds you stuff that you're already willing to believe, then you can see how media are an important agent of socialization. Your social environments more generally, who you interact with, and that's can be determined by where you go to school, who you hang out with, what clubs you belong to, where you work. All those things can help foster political socialization. Pause and make some notes. And again, that icon is there to remind you to have these notes in class, because I'll ask you to share out answers to this question. And just speculate a little bit how political socialization might differ between a democracy and a non-democratic state. So if I grow up in a democratic state, what agents are likely to foster my political socialization versus if I grow up in an authoritarian or a non-democratic state, what different agents might contribute to my political socialization. So take a moment, pause your video, jot down some notes there, and we'll discuss that in our next live class. All right, now that you're back with me, final thing I want to talk about today, final vocabulary word, is political culture. I'll be completely honest with you, I hate defining political culture because, like defining any kind of culture, it's slightly impossible. It's very difficult to pin down in any kind of methodologically satisfying way, but I'm going to take a crack at it anyway. Political culture describes the collective attitudes, values, and beliefs of citizens and the norms of behavior in the political system. So the things that we've been talking about so far, attitudes, ideologies, socialization, operate mostly on an individual level. I can take the political compass test and determine my political ideology. I can compare my political ideology to other people in the United States, and that will help me understand my political attitudes. I can list the agents of socialization in my life personally, but political culture is a thing that we analyze more on the society level, on the level of states or groups of people. So they determine people's collective attitudes. It's hard we don't have like a quantitative measure of political culture that's widely accepted, but a couple of questions that we ask when we're trying to describe the political culture of a given society. Fundamentally, what is it that people believe about the role of the government, right? So some people think immediately that if there is a problem in society, that the government should step in to fix it. Other people take the Ron Swanson type view that actually ordinary people should go fix it themselves. What individual rights do people believe should be protected? So in the United States, for instance, we have a much stronger belief collectively that individuals have the right to keep and bear arms under the Second Amendment than people believe in, say, the United Kingdom. What role do people expect to play in policymaking? Do you think that governance is something that just happens to you, or do you think that it's something that you can participate in? A really great example is the debates that took place in Cambridge this summer over whether or not and on what terms to reopen school buildings for students to come in. There was a fair amount of public participation in that process, and there was also a whole bunch of people, teachers and others, saying, hey, we haven't been included in this policymaking process, and our voices really should be represented if this is going to be a legitimate decision. Fourth, do people trust the government? Do they think it has legitimacy? Or do they just assume that the government is corrupt? Do they understand that if the government promises something, it's probably not going to happen, or it's only going to happen for people who have given favors to members of the ruling party? So what's the degree of people's trust in or skepticism about the government? And then finally, how do people strike the balance between freedom and equality? So a country where political ideologies tend to cluster in the more freedom, more equality piece of that graph that we looked at earlier has a different political culture than a country where people's ideologies cluster in a different quadrant of that graph. That's enough vocabulary for today. We will debrief all of these things in our next live session. So please, please, please come with any questions, clarifications, or interesting points that you want to contribute. Thanks. I'll see you soon.